Hi, my name is Jason Gilmore, and I'm the CTO of DreamFactory. In this screencast, I'll show you just how easy it is to generate a REST API for your Microsoft SQL Server database with no coding required using the DreamFactory platform. I'm currently logged into DreamFactory's web-based administration interface. This web interface is included with all editions of DreamFactory, including the open source edition, the silver edition, and the gold edition. Because this is our demonstration server, you'll see that a wide variety of supported connectors have already been configured, including MongoDB, Logstash, Oracle, Amazon S3, and MySQL. Now these are just a few of the almost 60 different services that DreamFactory supports. Now, in this screencast, I'm going to demonstrate creating a REST API for a Microsoft SQL Server database. I'll be connecting to a SQL Server instance hosted on Amazon RDS. However, the DreamFactory platform places no restrictions on where your database is hosted. All you need to do to generate the API for your database is to provide a set of database credentials and the ability for your DreamFactory instance's IP address to connect to your database over the specified port, which in the case of SQL Server is 1433. To generate an API, you'll click the Create button located on the left of the Services screen. And what's nice about the DreamFactory interface is that the service creation UI is practically identical for every service, meaning once you become familiar with it, creating new APIs will be a familiar and streamlined process. To create a new SQL Server API, I'll first select the desired service from the service type dropdown. SQL Server is, not surprisingly, found under the database option. In addition to SQL Server, you can see DreamFactory supports 17 other databases, including MongoDB, MySQL, Oracle, and Postgres, among others. So after selecting the SQL Server option, I'll begin by providing a name, a label, and a description. Now the name is particularly important because, as you'll soon see, it will form part of the REST URL structure for this connector. And because we want to begin using the generated API right away, I'll click or leave clicked the active checkbox. Next, I'll click on the Config tab. This is where the connection-specific configuration details are defined. This example involves interacting with a SQL Server database, so all I have to do is define the connection credentials. Typically, this includes the database host name, a username, password, port, database, and schema. So what I'll go ahead and do now is paste each of these values into the appropriate field. I'll begin with the host name, which again we are pointing to a SQL Server database residing on Amazon RDS. Then I'll enter the port, the database, the username, and I'll grab the password. And finally, the schema is DBO in this particular example. Now, in addition to supplying the credentials, you have the option of specifying a number of different settings. So for instance, you could set the API to be read-only by checking the read-only checkbox. You could also optionally enable connection pooling, specify driver options and attributes for connecting to your SQL Server. You could also enable upsert, put a cap on the maximum number of records returned by any GET request, and finally, you can optionally enable data caching. And in doing so, you would then specify the cache time to live in terms of minutes. For the purposes of this demonstration, we'll leave those options untouched and just generate the API by clicking the Save button. After pressing Save, you'll be returned to the Services Management tab, and at the bottom of this table, you'll find the newly created SQL Server service. You can click on the service to edit any of the details specified during the creation process. So you can change the name, which again will affect the URL, the label, the description. You could deactivate it if you so desire, and you can change the connection credentials if they happen to change at a later point in time. We don't actually need to change anything, so I'll next navigate to the API Docs tab to test out the newly generated REST API endpoints. The documentation is presented in alphabetical order, so I'll scroll down and click on the SQL Server entry to view the documentation. And as you can see, each generated API endpoint URI and its corresponding method are listed here. Now, the DreamFactory platform gives you everything you need to interact with the underlying database, including the ability to retrieve and execute stored procedures and functions. You can also manage the schema if, of course, the credentials used to connect to the database possesses the necessary privileges to do so. Now, most developers generally interact with a subset of these endpoints, including the stored procedure endpoints previously mentioned. And then if you scroll to the bottom, you'll find the CRUD endpoints, so the create, the retrieve, update, and delete endpoints. Now, because this is Swagger documentation, a useful interactive interface is included, which allows you to interact with the API without writing any code first. To do so, just click on the desired endpoint, and then click on the Try It Out button. Now, this endpoint retrieves the records found in a specific table. Now, this database contains, among others, a table called Customer. So as an example, we'll retrieve the records found in the table by supplying the table name in the table name field, which is found at the very bottom of the list of fields. Now, I will enter the customer table name here, and then to retrieve the records, I'll press the Execute button. Scroll down further, and you'll see that the records have been returned in JSON format. You also see the response status code, and in addition, you'll see what URL was used to query the endpoint, which is very useful when you do in fact start writing code. This is a useful tool to show you what your URL looks like when, most notably, other parameters are supplied. So just as an example of what other parameters you might pass along, let's adjust the query to only retrieve the customer's first and last name. So I'll scroll back up to the very top and you'll find this field's name. Click Add Item, and we'll add first name. I believe that, yeah, first name, and then we will add last name. And in addition, let's limit the results to 5 records, and that's done with the limit field. I'll scroll back down, press Execute again, and you'll see the updated response body, and sure enough, it's returned the first name and the last name. Again, we have a 200 status code, and you can see that 5 records have been returned. Furthermore, you see that the URL has changed. Again, that's our base endpoint URL, but now we're passing along a couple parameters, including fields, passing along first name and last name, and limit, which again we've limited it to 5 records. So as you can see, we just used 2 of many different parameter options available to you when querying tables via the API. So I invite you to play around with those and really get a feel for all of the many different things you can do with the DreamFactory platform in this regards. But next I want to move on to showing you how to create a new API key to interact with this REST API from outside of the DreamFactory platform. To create an API key, we'll first create a role which will restrict the API key to the SQL Server service. You can create a role by clicking on the Rules tab up top and then click the Create button located on the left side of the screen. We'll assign a name and a description. We'll set it to active because we want to start using it immediately. And next you'll click on the Access tab to define the role's scope of capabilities. So click on the plus sign located on the right. And next we're going to choose the service that's going to be associated with this role. I'll scroll down to SQL Server. And in this example, we'll just leave it set to star for the component, meaning that this the API key associated with this role has full access of the entire API. However, you're free to, for example, restrict it to just the customer table if you only wanted that API key to interact with the data found there, but not with anything else exposed through the API, which is a pretty nice feature. You can restrict the method access. So for example, if you just wanted the API key associated with this role to have read-only capabilities, you could just select get like that. Or if you wanted read and post, you could do that, and so on and so forth. What I will do is select all of them, giving the role the ability to interact with all of the REST methods. We'll leave this set to API, meaning that the role is able to interact via the API endpoints. And then I'll go ahead and press Save to save the role. Next, create the API key by clicking on the Apps tab located at the top of the screen. This is where the different API keys for your APIs are managed. To create a new API key, click the Create button located on the left. Assign a name and description. So we'll just call it SQL Server API. Call the description the same. We'll set it to active because we want to start using the API key immediately. We'll set application to no storage required because this is going to be a remote client. We'll use an HTTP client installed locally on my laptop. And then finally we'll select the role, and we called that role API. So I'll go ahead and assign that. And finally press Save to generate the API key. And as you can see here at the bottom of the table, we have a new API key associated with the SQL Server API application. To demonstrate how the REST API can be accessed from a third-party client, such as an iPhone or a web application, I'll copy the newly generated API key and head over to my test HTTP client. This client is called Insomnia, and it's a great desktop HTTP client for the Mac. However, there are a number of other clients available for download, including perhaps most notably Postman, which is supported on multiple operating systems. The DreamFactory platform expects the API key to be passed along via a header field named x-dreamfactory-api-key, which I've defined here. Now, neglecting to provide the API key results in a 400 status code and an error message regarding the missing API key. Incidentally, DreamFactory supports other methods of authentication, such as JWT, but I'll leave that topic for another screencast. Now, of course, we want to see what a successful request looks like. So I'll paste the API key into the header field. Note I've defined the request method to be GET, and then the URL to match what you saw earlier in the Swagger documentation. And I'll go ahead and press send again. And sure enough, our results are returned again in JSON format. So there you have it. Using the DreamFactory platform, you can expose your SQL Server database as a REST API in an incredibly short amount of time, with no time-consuming code refactoring or tedious configuration required. If you'd like to see firsthand how DreamFactory can dramatically reduce your API development expenses, contact us at info@dreamfactory.com to schedule a meeting with our engineering team.